Good to see you all. It's so nice to have you here. It is 4:02, so we're going to get started just to make sure that we stay on time today. We are so thankful that you're attending today's CFE community chat. We didn't really know what to expect when we first created this initiative back in the spring, but it's been super enjoyable for our team to develop, and it's also been pretty well received by our educator community. So today's chat is our 17th one since April, which is pretty remarkable for us. We have a super small team, and this was a brand new thing that we tried out and it worked. So thank you for being a part of it. For those of you who are new to CFE, the Chicago Foundation for Education, I'm Sarah Hoppy Knight, the co-executive director of the organization. We're a Chicago-based education nonprofit that's been around for over 36 years. We support and fund CPS educators so that they can best serve their students and grow in their profession. In a typical year, which this clearly is not, we typically award about 400 grants and fellowships to CPS pre-K through 12th grade educators. So moving into the session today, we know how incredibly exhausted you must be at the end of each day, especially now, and especially for those of you who are currently active working CPS staff members. It's such a challenging and tumultuous time right now for our Chicago educator community, and we are in complete support of you, and we are just incredibly grateful that you chose to spend a little bit of time with us this afternoon. So we know you have a million other things you could be doing, and we're just really thankful that you're here. So a few quick notes, housekeeping type things. Please keep your microphones muted throughout the meeting unless you raise your hand and are asking a question. And if you do have questions during the presentation, you can pop those in the chat box, or you can use the raise your hand function. So either of those is completely reasonable and acceptable for us for today's chat. This session is being recorded, and it'll be posted along with the PowerPoint presentation and any associated resources from our presenters on our website within the next few days. So Kayla, my lovely program associate, will be popping in a couple of messages in the chat throughout the course of the presentation. So just keep an eye out there and you'll have access to some of those resources immediately. All right, and I think that's it. So let's get into it today. Today we have two presenters from the Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum. Each year, the museum educators provide more contact hours of science, teaching, and learning support than any other museum in the city. They reach over 50,000 students and 1,500 teachers using living and preserved collections, as well as the Nature Museum's conservation work. Through both in-school and out-of-school time opportunities for Chicago students and teachers, museum educators impact the community by building knowledge, skills, interest, and enthusiasm for STEM topics. Museum education programs are founded in an inquiry-based approach to connecting our audiences to local nature and science concepts. And with that, I will turn it over to today's presenters, Amy Morton and Anna Schlecht, both of whom I should have said this is the third presentation in a series that we've been doing with the Notebaert Museum since the fall. And both Amy and Anna have presented at each of one of those two prior chats. So they're, this is old hat for them. And I'll pass it on to you too. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Nice to see everybody. I'm Amy Morton. I'm the Teacher Programs Manager at the Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum. And like all of the educators at the museum, I do a lot of everything at the museum. And so I have worked with students and I work with teachers and do program development. And we work at the museum and we also work at schools. And so when things are in person. And so that's where I am right now. And my background is about 11 years in the classroom. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
And I'm Anna Schlecht. I'm the School Partnerships Manager at the Nature Museum and do a lot of similar things to Amy. We work really closely to plan for teacher professional developments and student engagement. So really glad to see everyone tonight. Thanks for being here. Okay, well then I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we can go ahead and get started. All right.
We're excited. We have a few different opportunities for people to share some ideas and have some conversations. Right now, it's kind of a small group. So feel free to share your ideas in the chat. And if you want to share your ideas out loud, let us know. But we do have lots of opportunities to share in the chat.
All right. How does that look for everyone? Good. All right. We were telling our CFE folks that we're a little bit green to Zoom. So thanks for bearing with us there. Awesome. So we've had a chance to, introduce ourselves, but we'll do a little bit more introduction to the Nature Museum in just a moment, and a bit about our theories and mission and things that we're excited to incorporate into our presentation tonight. We'll do some focusing on student questions and explanations and the inquiry process in general. And then we'll connect that to some Nature Museum resources and be sure that they're both rigorous and equitable. Okay, we kind of covered that already. And for those of you who haven't joined us for our other chats, just a quick reminder of what our building looks like. It's also behind me in my virtual background tonight. But here's in the nice warm summertime, you can see our outdoor grounds here, which are very much a part of our Nature Museum. We consider our exhibits to be indoors and outdoors. You can see our casting pier over here, our prairie here, and our solar panels and our green roof. We have a lot going on at our physical building. So it's always nice for me to do some regrounding in this space, even though I haven't been there in a long time, and I know many of us haven't, but nice to remember.
Okay, leave it over there, I'll get it.
Our sense of place. So we thought we would open up with an icebreaker just to get us engaging with the chat a little bit here. We'll have a few opportunities to use the chat to share out tonight. So you can just take a moment to read here. Would you rather spend a day exploring Starved Rock State Park or Indiana Dunes State Park? So you can type your response in the chat. I can't do both. It's looking like a pretty even balance so far. Awesome. Well, thanks for practicing it. Again, just using that chat feature. And we can go ahead and just regrounding in our mission here. At the Nature Museum, we really want to create positive relationships between people and nature through collaborations, education, research and collections, exhibits, and public forums. So the list kind of goes on and on, but essentially what our mission is that we're connecting people to our nature, our region's nature and science. So we have a strong local focus at our Nature Museum. So really wanting it to be relevant and place-based for our audiences. And just to break this down a little bit more, more fully, we can see our museum learning approaches here. So using real things. I know Sarah mentioned this when she was kind of giving us our preview here, that we do a lot with object-based learning in our collections at the museum. Again, that local real world phenomena focus. We have what we refer to as learning ecosystems. So connecting that in and out of school learning, which we know maybe looks a little different this year, but still bridging that connection to cultural institutions and informal learning to formal learning. Sorry, did a little pre-scrolling there. I don't know what just happened. Pardon me. Oh dear, there we go. Okay, and then hopping right back in. The student-centered instructional approach. And so that'll come up a lot, especially tonight, thinking about putting students at the center of the learning. And that also incorporates the whole child learning approach. So being sure that we're supporting them in social emotional growth as well as content. Okay, so we get to be both students and teachers and adult learners tonight. And so we're going to start off by doing some observing. And so this video here, we're just going to do some noticing and see what you see. Right? And I did intentionally mute the sound if you're listening eagerly. We're just looking right now. Okay, so just a short little spurt there from that video from our YouTube channel. And if you'd like to share any noticings in the chat, you're welcome to, but we'll continue to do some observing. Okay. And apologies, I with my tiny little screen here, I'm not able to see the chat, so feel free to also unmute and share out that way too. Okay.
I can also monitor the chat, Anna. So
okay, thanks, Amy. Great. And so we thought we'd continue our observation and noticing here by thinking about these questions. How are these pictures similar? How are they different? So there's picture number 1 right here. Picture number 2. We can think about this prompt here as well when we're answering those questions in our brains. Here are 2 images of the same place. What do you notice? So you can think about that for a moment. Okay. And we're going to zoom in on that second photo here. And now's our opportunity to use the chat again to type our noticings specific to this image. What do you notice?
we're excited to hear what everyone has to contribute. This is kind of, we're sort of gathering the supplies and the ideas that we're going to work with throughout the whole unit. So I see someone's noticing seed heads. The color palette is kind of a sandy color palette.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I was able to open my chat up. Snow,
Native
seed heads.
plants.
Yeah. Frozen water.
Mm-hmm.
Oh. Missing green. Interesting. Okay. So we got to just do a quick burst there, thinking about looking at this through a learner's perspective, a student mind perhaps. Also seeing some more things come through in the chat. Thanks for sharing there. And so by doing that observation, we, of course, are engaging in some sort of student sense making, but I'm curious in the chat if you can embellish on this idea a bit more. What does student sense making mean to you? We'll have a chance to do lots of student sense making tonight. All right. And we'll revisit this idea a bit later too. If you are just kind of keeping that idea in your brains for now, that's totally fine as well.
So, right. So making connections to newly learned knowledge and previous experience. So we're thinking of developing understanding, maybe some parts of it, what it looks like, a little bit of a personal definition, listening without qualifying, students' thoughts and words. Okay.
Great. And so our next step, we've done some observing, we've done some comparison and contrast, and we zoomed in on that one particular image, and you all were already generating a lot of awesome ideas in the chat. Thinking about, pushing this a little bit further, as I'm sure many of you do in your classrooms, virtual or not, thinking about gathering student questions. So this has, I think, been one of our favorite tools for doing this in the virtual space, is just this quick little text box. and filling it in with some places to collect student questions, and then generating initial explanations. So those initial thoughts about, what is actually happening here? Why do we think that is occurring? And so using this as our structure, I don't know if anyone has any other questions that are coming to mind that you want to go ahead and type in the chat. We did pre-populate the next slide, but if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat. And so here were just a few ideas that we were coming up with that we thought maybe students would ask, maybe things you are curious about as you observed that image or those series of images. So some of the questions could be, are the plants dead? Are the trees dead? Are the animals dead too? Things we could imagine happening in a classroom, right? And maybe some initial explanations. Maybe the plants got too dry. Maybe the plants are just cold. Maybe the plants are dead. We could go on and on, right? All right. And
I think,
go ahead, Amy. Yeah.
I think that one thing that's important to think about here is when we ask students to do some noticing, it comes out in a lot of different ways. Sometimes they let us know what they see, and sometimes those questions are so organic they just come right out, and they start to wonder really authentically. And then the other thing that happens is they start to do that explaining, right? And so things that their comments and ideas come out in a lot of different forms. They come out in this is what I see, and then they come out in like, I wonder what's happening here. And then, oh, I think I saw this before. They make connections. They start to want to explain. That's kind of how their brains are proceeding. And so it's so great to collect all those ideas because they're really valuable for getting us started in this inquiry process.
Definitely. And then looking at the screen now, speaking of the inquiry process and ways to get us started or ways to gather some of these ideas, many of these might be familiar to you all. Oh, sorry, again, still getting used to Zoom. There we go. In the physical classroom, it might be a, hard copy driving question board where we're gathering questions on sticky notes. We keep adding to it. It's iterative, it's interactive and evolving. Perhaps in the remote classroom, how this looks is, again, just quick text boxes where it's a virtual sticky note in place of the hard copy sticky note. And this could be something that's a shared document where, if age appropriate for your students, they're typing directly into those text boxes. Could be a class anchor chart where the teacher is the one entering that information in, thinking about observations, questions, initial explanations, and again, the teacher would keep circling back to that document. All right.
Great. So there was a comment in the chat about students go get to lakefront very often, and so experiences with nature are always new. And one thing that's really great is we will talk about starting points a little bit later, but for a lot of students, they have they're very interested in things that they see in nature, especially things that they might not see very often, or maybe things that are a little bit similar to something that they've looked at before. And so this really gets their thinking going. And so we're going to start now to talk a little bit about in the classroom, who's doing the thinking, right? And so when we think about teaching science, sometimes we might think a little bit about how we learn science, which is probably someone just told us a whole bunch of stuff. And we're trying in our classrooms maybe to think about ways to get the students to do the thinking. And so these student questions are so authentic that we want them to know that this is where the inquiry is coming from. And so, slide. We could start with a question that's about, the students might start with something like, are the plants dead? But then they might be thinking about if that's really true or not, or they might be thinking about if the plants are dead, how did they get that way? So this just one question can start to inspire lots of different initial explanations. And so they might be saying, maybe they're alive, but they're just dry. Maybe they didn't get enough water. And it's important when, as the teacher, to really let the students know that that's where we want to go, that we want the teaching to go in the direction that they're thinking, right? So we want it to make sense from the student's point of view. Okay, so if we have this question that's maybe they're alive or and they're just dry, right? Then as a teacher, we can do a little bit of conversation to turn that into an investigation. So if the student's saying maybe they're alive, just dry, maybe the teacher could say something like, can you say more about that? And the students can make some more connections, then other students can generate some ideas about how to test that. And so just from a student question and one initial explanation, we have the start of an investigation. And as a science teacher, probably that might have been something that you might have known that they might ask, and then you might be all prepared to do an investigation that helps students to answer this question. Okay, so now we're going to do a quick investigation that's really responsive to those student questions. So we've got some flowers. We're going to stick them in some water. We're going to see what happens. And then you can do this remotely. You can do this in the classroom. And then what we want to do is we want to have the students explain what we noticed. And so as you're noticing, what you can see is the students are doing the thinking and the students are really at the center. Okay, great. So, okay, great. So we're still thinking about this investigation that we just did, and we start with the noticing, and then in this student discussion that's over here in the rainbow of text boxes, you can see that students might respond in lots of different ways. They might not agree, and that's okay. Do they know what's happening? It seems like maybe they don't know what's happening quite yet, and that's also okay. The best way to find out what's happening is to observe for themselves. All right, so one of the things that we're thinking about when we're doing all of this student sense making is we're wanting students to be building this background knowledge so that they can start to make sense of these ideas themselves. And so they might be doing some observing, they might be doing some growing things, they might count things or visit places or something, all along the way to figuring out about a lot about plants, right? And so a lot of this, you can see that this is very related to those science practices that we often talk about, and the students are doing the active thinking. We sometimes talk about it as students doing the heavy lifting. Great. So one of the things that we might be thinking about is how we can provide students opportunities to use discussion to increase their own and others' understanding. All right, and so it's very interactive and student-led. But of course, as the teacher, it's important to think about this idea of, you know where you're going, and it's going to be helpful for you to do a little bit of guiding. We might call it framing of the discussion. But in a discussion, of course, we have the student moves and we have some teacher moves. And so some of the student moves might be some of these things that you've established in your classroom, which might look like we sometimes call it accountable talk, talk science, classroom talk, productive talk. And so sometimes it's sentence stems, and generally it's those discussion norms that help students to listen carefully to what their peers are saying, to share what they notice, and also to respond to each other. They may agree, they may disagree, they may want to build on each other's understandings. And so in a lot of classrooms, these discussion norms not only move the inquiry forward, but they also do a really good job of building a classroom culture of curiosity, but also consensus. So those two things are really important as we're moving through the discussion. And then one of the things that we've found really helpful as another student move is ways for students to stay involved in the discussion, even if they're just doing a lot of thinking, and ways for students to respond to each other in a way that's both positive and visible. And so these particular silent signals we've found are super helpful in both an in-person and a remote setting. And you might already use these, but we really love them, so we talk about them all the time. So the agree sign, I'm just going to show you the agree sign. Basically, it looks like this, and it means, yeah, I'm thinking the same thing you're thinking. And you can look around the classroom and you can see who is agreeing with what's being said, and so you don't have to ask as many people. And if students want to add more, they can just put one hand on top of the other like this. It means I want to build on what someone else is saying. One of the things we like about this disagree sign, which is make your hands go like this across the front of your face, is that it doesn't pass judgment on the idea that's just been shared. And so sometimes when we use agree and disagree as thumbs up and thumbs down, that sometimes in our minds might have a meaning of good idea and bad idea, right? And so we feel like agree and disagree are a great way to share, for students to share what they think about some ideas that have been shared without passing a judgment on it one way or the other. All right, and so we've talked a little bit about, oh, good. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Amy, too, a lot of the feedback we've had from teachers about using these silent signals is that even the kids that don't speak up normally are really able to participate in this way. So it can be just a really unifying thing for the class, for everyone to feel like they have a voice or some way of joining the conversation.
Great. So the when we're carrying on a productive talk in our classroom or a productive discussion, one of the things that's important is that we're not just thinking about the student moves, but that we're also thinking about the teacher moves. And these particular teacher moves come from an article about productive talk in the classroom. And you can see that the teacher has some things to do, but also thinking about things that teachers are doing less of. So less talking to students, we all know that, this idea of avoiding this idea of the sage on the stage. But then the other thing that we've been talking about is this idea of less showing or sharing agreeability to student ideas. And so I don't know if you noticed when you were sharing your ideas about the images that we looked at, Anna was saying, oh yeah, okay, doing a little bit of repeating and not really telegraphing what was the right answer or the wrong answer. So that's something that's important to think about too. And this idea of thinking through ideas with students, sometimes in some frameworks it's called teacher framed discussions. So they talk about teacher framed and student framed discussions that help the students to be building their own understanding and the understanding of others. Great.
Awesome. And so building on what Amy was just talking about, thinking about this idea of unifying starting points. So what's in this yellow box here, one shared experience that is accessible for all students, can be open-ended, and all ideas are accepted. That's something I know we write into a lot of our lessons from Nature Museum curriculum is accept all answers. So I think that's particularly relevant here when thinking about this shared experience. It's a great way to provide an opportunity for students to engage without, hopefully, the background knowledge barriers, as we like to refer to them. It could be an object, it could be an image, a video, some sort of experience activity. And they can interact with this starting point in a lot of different ways. Just like we did at the beginning of our time together, we could be thinking about questions or observations. You could also do some thinking with your pencil, doing some drawing. We could generate some initial explanations about what we think might be happening in that particular starting point. And then those personal connections, I think, is another really important point here. Students always love to share, oh, my grandma does this, or I've seen this butterfly before, or all those great things that we always hear from students. So by having a shared starting point, sometimes we can really forge that deeper connection for students and their personal lives. And then over here on the right-hand side of the screen, thinking about how this provides opportunities for everyone, that really equitable and accessible approach. So it's not necessarily dependent on a particular language. Understanding it could be really simple observation. We're thinking about what we see, and that's helping students develop that concurrent language development. So not front-loading all that vocabulary right from the start. We've been talking quite a bit about consensus definitions. So having students arrive at those, working together as a class to define what we're looking at. We can identify misconceptions, and again, we have that in the parentheses here as the teacher. So maybe you're identifying them, maybe you're not correcting them right away, but you're hearing where your students are at. So it functions a bit as a pre-assessment. And then you can modify the unit to respond to the student input. So maybe you've identified those misconceptions they were noticing. Maybe if we refer back to that picture we looked at, all the plants are something, right? They add their misconception, and we can go ahead and add that into the lesson as something we want to come back to and address.
So I just wanted to add one more thing about starting points is we started today with a starting point that was a very accessible starting point, but it was very rich. There were lots of things to observe. People could use that starting point to go in lots of different directions. I saw a few comments about plants. I saw some comments about animals. So a shared experience like that is a great way to start out in a way that that includes all students. Sometimes if we start out about what do you know about plants in winter, right? Then that might exclude students who don't know about plants in winter. But if we do this shared experience, it really includes everybody.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think to build on what you just said, Amy, too, it's this iterative process, right? If we're going through this inquiry-based approach to looking at, let's say our starting point is the picture that we just looked at, we're going to encounter a few different starting points. So that's one of the ways we could interact with this content or idea. And maybe we look at a few different starting points. We come back to a unifying place as a class and have a new place where we gain new understandings and have that shared experience. So a lot of iteration, I think, will be another theme we hear tonight. And so perhaps we're adding on, you can see there those student little text bubbles here. Maybe they're hibernating. Maybe we start to understand a new idea as we gather more information. And we'll do some more evidence gathering in just a little bit. Okay. But before we do that, just wanted to highlight here again about the inquiry process. So maybe we're comparing a place, we're comparing the plants. Like we did at the beginning, we looked at that same place at two different times a year. We looked at the plants, we zoomed in on a particular photo there to look closer. Can observe over time, looking across the seasons. Can investigate the plant parts. Some of you mentioned something about seed heads on the tops of the plants. could grow some plants. You could have a real tactile investigation that way. Could do some counting and have a math connection. Lots of different ways to gather evidence. And so something I think are particularly fond of in the virtual setting, and this definitely functions well in person too, is to use some images as starting points, especially if it's an image none of your students have seen before. Then you can all start off on the same page. And we really liked this quote that we had from some teacher feedback from a nature museum program. So they were talking about how after participating in our programs, they felt more confident including nature and nature connections in science, and that they even took their own pictures for students to make observations. So maybe that's something that you're doing for your students, but definitely want to empower you to, feel like that's a good match for you and your students. When you're on a walk, it could be something simple as what you find in the cracks on the sidewalk. That's one of our favorite things to reference. It's the little things that we see that can be really relevant for our students too. And then this is just a little pro tip we like to highlight, and maybe you noticed I did this earlier with the video we watched. We selected just a small part of the clip and muted the sound. That avoids a lot of the telling. Some of these videos, and this might seem like common sense, but I think for me it was a little bit of a shift in my brain to think about using a video not as both audio and video, but just for observations, and then the kind of the mystery isn't spoiled sometimes with audio, which is going to tell us all the answers. So just some tips there. And then that final bullet point, thinking about watching a little, pausing, doing some prediction, getting a sense of where students are at with that video, watching a little bit more, and then discussing and reflecting.
So before you move on, Anna, I'm wondering if maybe we could take a minute and ask some teachers about their ideas about how images and videos have played a part in their classrooms in this remote setting, because I think that you're right. Images and videos have been really such a big part in, played such a big part in the learning. So I'm interested to hear what teachers have to say about the role of images and videos, and how have you used them the same way or different ways than you've used them before? Love to hear a couple teacher ideas.
I don't know whether this is the answer, but we did a project where the kids grew seeds, and the questions were, does a plant need water to grow, and does a plant need light to grow? And I set up a Padlet and I asked them to take pictures. And so all the kids could upload their pictures, and then everybody could see all the different plants. And so it was very visual. The cups with no water and no light, there was nothing there, and everybody could compare.
Right.
Awesome.
So I think this idea of student images, which isn't something we often have the opportunity to get in the classroom, is images that are generated by students. Yeah, that's great.
That is awesome.
Any other ideas people wanted to share?
My students were talking about the 4 spheres of the Earth. So usually we would do a study site observation together at school. But instead, they were encouraged to go to their front yard, backyard, any outdoor space, and take a picture or draw a picture of what they saw. And then they'll be talking about just observations based on their senses. But then our next thing is to sort them into the different spheres. But they're all excited to take pictures of their dogs running around in their backyards, or pigeons on the sidewalk.
I like the idea of taking pictures and drawing, because those different students can connect with in different ways to the things that they see. And sometimes we promote drawing as sort of like a way to look more closely. And then the other ways we love to do drawing is to figure something out. And so sometimes if we're doing a little figuring out, like if you're talking about your spheres, right? Like diagrams of what's happening are always such a great way to think with our pencil, right? Yeah.
So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay. So my guys, we were doing something on the biological levels of organization, and I had them take a picture of something, tell me what level it was, and then tell me what the next level up would be, and give an example that pertained to that picture, and then what the next level down would be, and give an example of what pertained to that picture. And we got lots of wonderful pictures of dogs, people's dogs, cats, and little brothers. So it was very cute.
Great. Great. How about pictures that you all have taken yourselves? I hear a lot of ideas about student pictures. Any pictures you've taken yourselves? Phenomena that you've noticed out in nature as you've been walking around?
I was walking on south of the zoo and through the little pond and where the beavers are, and so I took a picture of the little island, which the beavers have now all destroyed all the trees, and we had a little conversation about what's going, if beavers live here, what do you notice about the island, and like trying to get them to think about the effect of the beavers on the plants, the trees.
The area. Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. So interesting. I heard about the beavers over there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That is so cool. I know something we're doing a lot of at the Nature Museum is just this thing that we're talking about now, which is gathering our own photos to be using in our curriculum, in our conversations with teachers. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of power in that, especially with the connections to the places we see and the time of year, and just really making it real world for us and students, right? We can feel really connected to students and our places. Okay. So we're on this idea of thinking about evidence gathering. And so we have a lot of different ways we can gather some evidence that relate to kind of our anchoring phenomena that we're focusing on. We started off our time together looking at those images of our Nature Museum prairie. We saw two different ones, and then we zoomed in on one particular one, and we generated some initial explanations. And so here's another way that this could be used, again, both in person or virtually, but could do a little bit of simulated outdoor activities. And so here we have some biodiversity sampling happening. So you can see that there's that red circle, and that's just trying to indicate, okay, our little Google Maps guy there is right here in this space. And then we're zooming in, and these would be the plants that we would see in that particular space. So we could do a lot with this particular sampling exercise. We could count the flowers. We could talk about the plants more generally, and then talk about what we see, what we don't see, have some really rich conversations based in this data here. Okay. And then building off of that, maybe we would create a graph, or this would maybe come from a different source. Maybe we're doing some more research online, but thinking about plants and how they're found in different abundance at different time increments.
And I think sometimes with students, what we sometimes do is jump straight to the graph, and especially with younger students, giving them the opportunity to collect some of that data and really experience how the data turns into a graph. You can see we've sort of done it a little bit here with a little bit of a pictograph kind of an approach, merging the pictograph with a bar graph. And so that helping students to make sense of what they're noticing by being able to take the experience of the counting and the noticing and then actually turn it into the data visualization sometimes those things, even for older students, sometimes giving them the opportunity to do that is a great way to continue that sense making process.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. And I think to bounce off what you were saying, Amy, about the pictograph element of this, that also can help, for our students who are more visually inclined and they're trying to make sense of this complex graph, or for some, might be less complex, it's hard to say, but using those images, then we can really bring it back to what we're measuring and what we're connecting to this data. Okay, we also wanted to show, actual outdoor biodiversity sampling. And so this can be done in a lot of different creative ways. This is just one of the ways that we do it in our workshops at the Nature Museum when we're in person. So we use just a simple hoop. You could use, an embroidery hoop. You could use a hula hoop. We use those too. We also have some PVC piping that we put together and use as a sampling hoop. Really anything that will help you identify a particular space. You have a set boundary. It could be string. It really could be anything. Thinking about doing some upcycling of materials you have near you. And then once you've identified your space, you can go ahead and look within it, doing some initial observation. We have students typically doing some drawing. So that idea of thinking with our pencils, we're already doing some close observation. And then that might move into some further data collection. So some counting, how many different species do we see here? Okay, interesting. Now let's compare it to another space. So you can see in these series of photos, some sampling happening in like a grassy area, a lawn, and then something happening in more of a prairie space. And so you can compare and contrast those places and gather some data that way.
This particular activity is we do this a lot at the Nature Museum in our field trip workshops, but it also works really well as an asynchronous activity for students. So if you showed students some pictures of you doing something like this, and the idea is to count how many of each, or count which types of plants were in the circle, then probably students could do this in their yard or out in front of their building on the parkway or something like that, maybe just right out in front of their front steps. So it's a great opportunity for your class to collect some data from all parts of the neighborhood where students might be, spending their time. So this activity, even though we often do it at the Nature Museum, it has a lot of asynchronous connections or opportunities.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. And then just to go back in time, thinking about this virtual sampling. So that's really what we're trying to convey here, or I guess almost the reverse of that, thinking about this real world way of sampling where we're actually in the field, counting those plants. We can also create that in the virtual space here by doing a simulated circle. There's our little hula hoop, or whatever you want to refer to it as, our sampling area, and then the plants that we would have found within that space. So a lot of different ways to gather information, but we're back at our place. So we maybe have already learned a bit about this place. We've seen it a few different times now, but wanted to reground us in our place. And now, wait a second. This is still our place, but what do you notice now? Feel free to type in the chat or unmute and share.
Maybe we can think about, how do we know it's the same place? And okay, maybe it looks like it's been mowed.
Go back to this one.
Okay.
And this
like
one.
A different season.
What do you notice? I see
New
some
growth.
stuff. New growth, yeah. What do you see that makes you say that? New growth.
Yeah.
It's like a different season. Oh yeah. And so I'm sure we're toggling between a few different things right now. We're in our student brains, we're in our teacher brains, we're in our, first time we've seen these images brains. So no problem. I know we are taking in a lot of information. Wanted to zoom in a little bit here. Sorry, my computer looks like its battery is getting low. Sorry about that. And so we've zoomed in on a particular area, kind of similar to what we did there with the biodiversity sampling. So you can see a zoomed in picture of what we might find in this space. So maybe you can contribute your additional observations now in the chat, or feel free to unmute again.
So one thing that we might want to think about is some of the initial explanations that in those questions that we started with, the questions and the initial explanations were, is it dead? Are these plants dead, right? And so we were thinking about, a little bit about that. And so that's been one of the things that we're trying to explain here. So this, of course, is an observation over time, right?
And
different seasons.
That's a good point. Going back here, just to refresh on some of the things we mentioned, maybe it's dead. The class on a path. Maybe there's some other elements that we can see in this picture here. Right. So maybe we've gained some more understandings, more noticings about this place, especially comparing it to the past. We've observed some new things here, to use the word I saw in the chat, new growth. And I'll hand it over to Amy here.
Great. So sometimes we use text as a starting point with our students. We sometimes read something and then we start to look at it, or for maybe if we're using a textbook or reading, right? And so we think text is also a great place to find that evidence. So if what we're doing is we're looking for ways that students can interact with the evidence themselves, maybe by observing, comparing, counting, and looking at things over different time period, right? So it's using text as some evidence to support the ideas that they're already coming up with. So maybe we're thinking about, can they support that initial explanation that they had? What are some ways that they can do that? So we're thinking about what the text tells us that we already found out in our investigation, and then what information is new. So you might be using texts that already exist, but we like to create our own texts that really meet the needs of the unit. And so we have a couple of pieces of text here that we've customized to help us out here. So what I'd like you to do, we're going to pretend we're 3rd to 5th graders right now, and maybe you could read this particular text selection, and then maybe you could type in the chat some things answering these 2 questions. What does this text tell us that we already found out in our investigation? So we've done some observing, and we've done a little bit of plant observations and observations of the place. So what does this text tell us that we've already found out in our investigation? And then what information is new? So maybe if you wanted to type anything in the chat that you think we already knew from the things that we've looked at so far. Or you could unmute and share, that's fine too. Okay, plants don't grow in the winter. We already found that out, right? We did a little experiment. We did some observations. Okay. Anything that we can see in this text that is new information, something that we didn't know yet? All right, so it tells us why that's happening. Great. And if we look at the next slide, so this is basically the this is a quote actually from that website that's down below, and so this is probably appropriate for our 6th to 8th grade students. And this talks about right, and so this talks about both kinds of plants, both kinds of dormancy, endodormancy and echodormancy, right? And so this is probably a chance for students who are grades 6 to 8 to find out a little bit more. And then this idea of I see shared a trigger for growth, very right, really interesting. So if we're thinking about this idea of who's doing the thinking, we're thinking of the students' explanations as the starting points. Great. Okay, go ahead, Anna.
Yeah. And so, yeah, thinking about how students are really paving the way here, we can take a moment to look at those little speech bubbles. I noticed plants coming up. It looks a lot like what I was seeing in the chat from you all. Does the green color mean they are growing? Are they the same plants? Maybe they come from seeds. I think that ties back to some of the things you all were sharing at the very beginning, looking at the winter version. I noticed that the dry plants are gone. Did people plant the seeds? So maybe, you know, we're coming up with a lot of different questions. Maybe yours match some of the ones we see on the screen now, but really allowing it to be in the hands of the students to ask those questions and drive the learning. Oh, I can see another thing in the chat here. What other plants need X number of days before regrowth? Question. And so you can see the one that's highlighted there. Maybe they came from seeds. And of course, we could do some data collection with that. So we could do some real-time investigations. Maybe we're planting a seed. I think that came up a little bit earlier too. Some of you were sharing your examples from photos that you've taken. And I think that connects really strongly to some of the ways that we might collect data. We had our virtual class plant at the beginning. Maybe you noticed that, something we found outside. We put it in the glass of water. 24 hours later, oh, looks the same. Maybe you want to practice thinking about seeds, and that's an extension from the question asking that was happening there. Again, cannot emphasize enough, this process is iterative. We'll have many different places for students to enter and engage with the information and the data collection. Another point here that we think is really important, especially coming to you from a cultural institution as a museum. Think about how we can collect data by interacting with other people in the community. Our scientists do this all the time, and we can all do this all the time. There's so many different ways to contribute to community-based or citizen science, as it's sometimes known as well. And so here on this next slide, we can think about how to really and actionably do this. Social action in the natural world. One of our favorite apps to use is a totally free app you could download right now. It's called iNaturalist. And even if you're not downloading it directly onto your device, you can still access all of this data online, which I think is so cool. It's a community sourced data bank. And so you can find, you know, your home, you could find your school, you can find pretty much any place on the planet and engage with this data that, again, is open source and is supported by people just like us who are taking photos on their phone. You can kind of see how it how it works in that little infographic. You record your observations, taking a photo, and then you'll share that photo through the app with other naturalists or other people in the community. After 3 people have reviewed that particular image, it'll go ahead and reach research grade, which is pretty cool, so that, you know, scientists and, again, other people in the community can use that information and help to discuss the findings. It can really help people of all you know, expertise and all levels of understanding in science and nature engage with some data. So that's pretty cool. So again, that's iNaturalist, a totally free app you can use.
One thing I love about iNaturalist is that it uses AI to identify what you've taken a picture of. And so sometimes if I'm out and I don't know what a plant is, or I don't know what a bird is, and I don't know what type of bird it is, I'll take a picture of it and put it into iNaturalist just to identify it. And then I might end up not posting it if it's like a dandelion or something. But it is really interesting because you can find out the names of things that you didn't know the names of before. And, you know, as grownups, we love to know the names of things, right?
Yes, that's a good reminder, Amy, that, yeah, it can be as robust of an experience as you want it to be. It can be simple ID. It could be contributing to this amazing data bank. However you want to interact with it is really cool. I know one of the ways I've interacted with it is a big spider crawled out of my drain and I wanted to know what that spider was. So I took a picture of it and lo and behold, an orb weaver it was.
Sometimes when you look at the maps of iNaturalist, what you'll notice around Chicago especially is that there's a lot of clusters of observations, and sometimes those clusters are right around schools because teachers are opening a class account for iNaturalist, and then they go out into the playground or they go out into the park close by, and students are making observations and posting them on iNaturalist in a little cluster. So it's pretty popular with teachers. It's really cool.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Oh dear. I think I've accidentally clicked on link. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, great. Oh, I don't know what's happening here. Ah. Sorry. Let's try that one more time. There we go. Sorry, everyone. And then going off of what we were just talking about with iNaturalist, Seek is another more kid-friendly version. So iNaturalist, I think, works really well for 6 through 8 and adults, and you can even use like the data in your classroom if you're working with younger students. I don't think there's any real harm in doing that, especially because there's a lot of great images that you can find attached to the data points. But Seek is another modified version of this app that will really support younger students. And it's kind of like a game. You can earn badges and explore that way and gain little accolades. So kind of fun. Okay. And let's see, can everyone hear the audio okay? Okay. Little music break for us. And then just like, again, in the spirit of evidence gathering and using a variety of different sources, perhaps you've heard of this before. It's something, you know, just like iNaturalist and Seek that aren't directly sourced from the Nature Museum, but things that are, I think, related to the work that we do. So, you know, not sponsored, but I think very valuable resources to bring up here. Amy, I don't know if you have anything else to add about Project Bloodburst, but feel free to hop in at any point. Yeah,
I think that Budburst and iNaturalist, some of the really important functions for students are not just the data collection, but this idea of close observation and really noticing, because that's when they start to do the sense making on their own, is when they're noticing what's happening and they're noticing what's changing, they're noticing those relationships. So these are some places where they can really start to do that really intense noticing of the outside world.
definitely. And a little bit more on Project Budburst. So you would just go online to register. Again, what Amy was saying, practice these observation skills, and you select a particular plant and watching that plant grow and change over time. And as it starts to grow its buds and those buds begin to burst, just like it's in the title, you would go online and then report that. So it helps to have little data sets across different places, and you can go ahead and compare and contrast those places and see what kinds of plants are growing. And then the Nature's Notebook, another great virtual tool to use to track seasonal changes. So you can see some great data visualizations by using this resource. I think that ties in nicely with our theme of the day, thinking about how plants can grow and change over time in different seasons. Okay. And then, just like we talked about with iNaturalist, there's modified versions for younger students. So there's Budburst Buddies. So thinking about just, you know, simplifying this in some ways, but still keeping a bit of the rigor and sentiment alive. So they're looking at it through some different ways on the Budburst Buddies. Okay. Another resource, and this is one of my personal favorites. I find it really interesting every time I'm on there, and always noticing new features, and just noticed one the other day that had me, you know, hooked in for about an hour. This is a really cool resource. If you haven't heard of it before, I know it's gained a lot of traction in recent years, but Google Arts and Culture, of course, being a museum, we have our own page, so you can look us up just typing in Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum and you'll find us there. But many, many other museums and cultural institutions have their high quality images and different specimen photos. Some of them have live or not live, interactive exhibits. So you can kind of go through a virtual reality simulation as you look around. But something we especially wanted to highlight when bringing up Google Arts and Culture is the use of high quality images. So we talked about earlier taking our own images and how that can be incredibly valuable for grounding in a sense of place, bringing it real world for students. That's awesome. And then if we want to build on that, say we've grounded our place, but we want to get a great picture. Someone brought up a beaver earlier. So maybe we've taken some real photos down there at the lodge by the Lincoln Park Zoo, but we want to look really closely at structure and function. So maybe we hop on Google Arts and Culture, find that picture of a beaver, and we can look really closely at its teeth or its tail, its webbed feet, all that great stuff. So it's as close as we can get to that specimen observation in real life, that object-based learning, but through our computer screens. Great. And so we've done so much evidence gathering and knowing that we could, you know, do this in many iterative cycles, but wanted to add a little bit more here. And this is a bit more for our teacher brains, and we'll unpack this idea a bit more in a little bit. All right. So go ahead and click play on this video.
protecting homes, businesses, health, and the environment since 1860.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to Curious by Nature. My name is Seth. I take care of the grounds and the plants here at the Nature Museum. I often get asked, do plants die during the winter? It's a good question. So let's go for a walk through the prairie and find out. I'm often asked if plants die in the winter because, as you can see, a lot of things are turning brown and appear dead. To answer that question, I'm going to talk about 3 different life cycles that plants typically use: the perennial life cycle, annual life cycle, and the biennial life cycle. I'm going to start with perennials. Perennials are plants that can live for many years. They may die to the ground in winter, but you even are more familiar with perhaps woody perennials such as trees and shrubs. Many trees and shrubs in our areas will lose their leaves over the winter, but as you know, the tree survives. With a woody perennial plant, at this time of year, most of them are busily taking carbohydrates and chlorophyll that they're processing into carbohydrates and withdrawing them in through the leaves and the stem tissue and down deep into the stem and the roots. And those sugars and starches will be stored until next spring, when the sap begins to flow back up the tree and buds are beginning to burst. The buds themselves remain alive at the tips of the branches. Many of them are covered with protective coatings, and they all contain different compounds that act as antifreeze to keep them from freezing solid in the winter. Aside from woody perennials, many other plants that you see in the prairie are perennial, but they don't have that woody trunk and woody root system to store carbohydrates through the winter. So what are they doing to survive? Well, they're going about the same process of pulling all that nutrients down into the ground, and they use what are called storage organs to keep that ready for the springtime. Many plants will use what are called rhizomes, which is a modified underground stem. This is a Canada goldenrod that I've pulled out, and you can see here the horizontal rhizomes spreading out from the center of the plant. These all contain a good deal of starches that the plant can use for growth in warmer times in the winter, and then when the spring arrives, many of these will form vertical stems once again, and the plant will be renewed. Another common strategy that plants use for surviving the winter is to put all of their resources into their seeds. This is what annual plants do. This plant is called beggar's ticks. It's Biden's polylepsis, and you can see that there's quite a number of dried flower heads here. The idea for annuals is to grow quickly, produce many seeds, and they tend to have a more shallow root system because they're not counting on surviving through the winter. In fact, they'll die and the progeny will live on in the form of seeds. The third major life cycle that plants use to survive the winter is the biennial life cycle. This is a parsnip that I just pulled out of the vegetable garden. Parsnip sprouts in the spring, grows throughout the summer, and late in the year begins to form this taproot, which is the storage organ that will provide the fuel for the plant to grow in the spring. Next spring, new leaves will emerge, and eventually, when temperatures warm up sufficiently, a stalk will arise containing the parsnip flowers. Those flowers will produce seeds, the seeds will fall, and the parsnip will then die off. So a biennial lives through 2 growing seasons and 1 winter. So we've seen how plants use different life cycles and strategies to survive the winter. But plants, for the most part, reproduce by seed. And that happens for annuals, perennials, and biennials. Here at the museum, fall is a time for us for seed collecting. We'll spend quite a bit of time harvesting seed from the prairie, especially seeds that we think might not fall back into the prairie itself, but might fall on the concrete or someplace kind of useless to us. We'll gather the seed up and spread them to parts of the prairie that might need a little more support. Or if we want to diversify a certain area, we might take some seed from one spot and put it in another. That's our show for today. Thanks for watching. There's so much to see and learn about outside, even as we head into the winter. Be sure to leave any questions you have in the comments and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we'll see you next time on Curious by Nature.
So we love this video. We hope you love this video too.
Support for the Nature Museum is provided by Rose Pest.
And one of the things that we're often tempted to do with our students is to show them this great video that we found. And so we're going to talk a little bit now about why this video might not be the best starting point for student sense making. I've seen lots of things in the chat that I think are probably that we're probably going to talk about. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So in the next slide, we, as adults, we might say, whoa, great video, all my questions are answered. And then if we think about why it works for us as adult learners, that's because we have a lot of background knowledge going into this experience of this video. So maybe you took high school biology, maybe you have read a book about plants, maybe you have a family garden, maybe you have house plants, maybe you've been to the botanic garden. So you have a lot of experiences over your time as a grown-up that are adding to your understanding of this particular video. But when we're talking about wanting the students to do the thinking, right? If we're thinking about who's doing the thinking, we notice just the vocabulary that is embedded in this particular conversation with Seth. There's a lot of things that your students might not be familiar with. So many words. All of these words came from this particular video. So I know that we've talked a lot about today about student sense making, and sometimes we're thinking about those best practices in science instruction, student-driven inquiry, that understanding takes time, that it's gonna, that the students are doing the heavy lifting. And all of those things are supported by some of our more recent developments in science education. Of course, the NGSS and the framework for K-12 science education, that is the grounding for the NGSS, encourages us to let the students do the sense making by using those practices and using the practices to engage with the content. And this idea that instruction builds on prior interest. So these shared experiences that we've talking about, these starting points happening all along the way, the initial starting point, and then those subsequent starting points that add content and evidence. They're building on the interest and identity that is as important as the knowledge itself. So we want students to be feeling connected, and we want students to feel like the learning sequence is coherent and makes sense to them, and also is relevant to their lives. When, as you can see, all of those experiences that we let our students engage in, and that we encourage our students to engage in, they are all adding to this idea of sense making. They're asking questions and explaining, revising, investigating, and it can happen through conversation, it can happen through listening, it can happen through drawing, observation, and even if they're trying to defend their ideas to others. So hopefully we've got you doing some thinking about collecting evidence about things in the neighborhood, maybe plants or maybe other things in the neighborhood. Anybody have any ideas they want to share about collecting evidence in the neighborhood? You can share in the chat or share out loud. Oh, tracks in the snow. I've seen so many tracks in the snow and the mud. That's such a great starting point, right? Yep. Great. Definitely leaves, the seed head scavenger hunt, especially if the scavenger hunt is connected to the places, right? If students can connect those things that they find to the places that they find. Yeah, so many things to observe at this time of year in the neighborhood, anywhere, right? Yeah, so hopefully we've got your brain thinking about some student sense making. So if you have any ideas that you want to share, things that you're thinking now about this idea of student sense making and centering students' ideas to drive the inquiry, we can share out loud or type in the chat, whatever works for you. Journaling is a great form of student sense making. Yeah. Sometimes students doing shared diagrams, working on each other's diagrams and journals. Yep, discussion. Yeah, there's so many advantages to discussion. It's a little bit harder to do in the remote setting, but I think that there are a lot of classrooms who are showing some real success with that. Great, right? Connecting to plants that we eat. Yeah, connecting plants we see outside to plants we eat. Yeah. Great. So feel free to continue to add those ideas in the chat. We just wanted to make you aware of a few Nature Museum resources that you can continue to use. You can use them as starting points or to enrich your own understanding of things. If you go to naturemuseum.org online -resources, there are so many different things that you can find that we've been producing over our time out of the building. And so we've connected with schools, we've connected with the public, we've connected with other scientists. And so there's so many resources on there that you can access. We've been producing some live things. We've been producing things in the museum and outside of the museum, doing lots and lots of nature connections. So hopefully some of those are something that you might find interesting. We have lots of digital resources. We have Wonder at Home and Curious by Nature on YouTube, which is, you can see that Seth's video is available on YouTube. So that's also a really great resource for yourself or for your classroom. Remember, you can show them without the sound if you want. And then we also have a lot of digital resources. We have, of course, our blog, and we have some print resources as well. So I don't know if anybody has any questions or anything they'd like to share. Our time is almost up, and I know you probably want to have a little bit of time to do your survey and your eval forms. So if you want, you can, Sarah can get that stuff started. And if you have additional questions for us, feel free to contact us or put any questions in the chat that we could answer later if you want.
So just as a reminder, thank you both so much, by the way. This was fantastic. I also love that video. I thought it was so great. Made me miss the museum even more. So I put both chat links in the chat itself. One is for us. It's a survey about the chat experience that you had for CFE. And then the second one is for PDH credits. So we're able to provide PDHs to you all through our vendor experience with ISB, and we're happy to do that. So I popped those both in. We also, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the chat itself too, but we'll be sending a link to the presentation itself, plus the slide deck with all of those wonderful resources, and those two survey links towards the end of the week. So that'll be coming in an email to you as well. But we do have a couple more minutes. If people have questions, certainly feel free to unmute and ask your question or pop it in the chat box. Trying to take that teacher beat just to make sure everyone has space. Okay, well, again, I just want to thank Anna and Amy. You both were fantastic, so passionate, and providing such wonderful information and resources for all of us. So I'm incredibly grateful, and I know everyone else is here. I'm also very grateful for everyone who attended, those especially here now who stayed for the entire thing. Again, we know it is a very difficult time right now. There's a lot going on, and we as an organization, CFE, are here for you. We exist for our educators, and that is what our focus is. So if you have any ideas for future chats like these, if you have questions, if you want to talk to us about our other programming, again, we do a lot of grant making for educators in under the broad CPS umbrella. So that includes traditional schools, but also charters and magnets and that sort of thing. So don't hesitate to reach out. And I just hope you all are hanging in there and you know, kind of take care of yourselves, because it's an important thing to do right now. So at any rate, Anna and Amy, thank you again so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Okay, have wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.